not going to go through a general introduction on women and genocide, and I'm actually going to not go through the literature review, but I will give some credit to scholars who have informed some of the work that we're doing. Martha and I are interested in looking at women and genocide in the context of women's presence in genocide memorials and also their active role in the memorialization process. So women's participation in memorialization, because we believe that this actually can provide us a lens for understanding how a society reconciles and remembers its violent past, as well as its effects on those who have experienced that violence and subsequent generalization. And also for us, we sort of define memorials as not just sort of brick and mortar sort of forms, but various forms. We recognize that it can take various forms. And so we wanted to look at what we consider to be two understudied genocides of the 20th century, Cambodia and Guatemala. And during the Cambodian genocide from 75 to 1979 under the Khmer Rouge, an estimated 1.7 million Cambodians perished under this brutal regime. In Guatemala, the genocide occurs within the context of that country's 36-year civil war in which the genocide takes place. So between 1981 and 83, in a period that's known as La Violencia, over 600 Mayan villages were destroyed, and an estimated 200,000 Mayan men, women, and children were massacred, along with massive numbers of displaced and disappeared. So relative to the study of other genocides of the 20th century, both the Cambodian and Guatemalan genocides are largely understudied. Also less represented within the context of these genocides is a gendered lens that allows us to understand how women experience this genocide. And we all know that women remember differently apart from men in that same context. So both of these genocides provide what we consider to be meaningful comparative analysis. While the genocides in Cambodia and Guatemala occurred just a few years apart, in both cases accountability in the form of tribunals has only been recent and not very far-reaching in terms of bringing perpetrators to justice. Both societies have annual commemorations to honor their respective genocides. In Cambodia, the once National Day of Hatred has since been renamed the Day of Remembrance, and in Guatemala, genocide commemoration is spearheaded by social movements on Armed Forces Day to remember the victims of the military regime. In Cambodia, the inception of two sites in particular, Chong Ek and Tul Slang, are often characterized as promoting a particular political agenda and pursuing economic gain through the appeal of dark tourism at the expense of memorialization of the victims, including women. In contrast, Guatemala memorialization takes the form of shrines, street art, and makeshift informal remembrances that are largely tendered by women and do not form part of the tourist trade. Also, in Cambodia, we find no real reconciliation or truth commission in contrast to Guatemala. In part, I believe this is because the current regime are members or former members of the Khmer Rouge. In Guatemala, we have the state official denial of the genocide. Within both the Cambodian and Guatemalan genocides, we don't have stories of rescue, of hiding, of partisans, or we don't have the richness of diaries that document the day-to-day. The genocides that we believe that these are genocides in search of an identity beyond the labels of the Auto genocide in Cambodia and the Mayan genocide in Guatemala. Both have an ideology rooted in communism. For example, in Cambodia, it was the Communist Party of Kampuchea that actually spearheaded the genocide, and in Guatemala, it was the attempted eradication of perceived communism that led to the destruction of the Mayan communities. So for us, memorialization we wanted to look for a form of identity of these genocides through this memorialization process. I do have to note that our scholarship has been informed by the work of scholars Bridget Sion, Janet Jacobs, are indebted to your work, James Young, Rebecca Jinks, and so on. When we look at the specific memorialization of in Cambodia of women, memorial sites do not form part of the post-genocidal narrative. And so for me, this begged the question, why? Why not? To answer this question requires an examination of landmark genocide memorials in Cambodia to unpack the presence of gender. One could argue that memorialization of the Cambodian genocide began almost immediately. The Vietnamese invasion of Democratic Kampuchea in December 1978 effectively halted the genocide as the Khmer Rouge cadre fled the capital to the north and northwest border regions. The incoming Vietnamese army entered Phnom Penh, accompanied by these former Khmer cadres, those who managed to escape the internal purges of the Khmer Rouge at that time. And when they did so, they discovered by accident this former high school turned prison, Tol Slang, also known as S-21. Among the prisoners' written confessions and other remaining evidence that was uncovered by the Vietnamese were these thousands of passport-like photos that were taken of each prisoner as they processed through this particular killing center. And it was the Vietnamese who turned Tol Slang into a museum in 1980, and it was primarily intended to portray the atrocities of the Khmer Rouge while simultaneously legitimizing their occupation of Cambodia. And initially it was not a site of memorialization. Any Cambodians who came to this site after it was open actually did only in search of information for missing relatives. So today, Tol Slang is an international tourist destination for visitors to bear witness to the atrocities of the Khmer Rouge. But what does one see when they enter Tol Slang? The visitor is confronted with panels of photos that display faces in various stages of fear, confusion, and even defiance. Each prisoner is identified only by a number. The hundreds of images exhibit individuals who remain nameless. It is only upon closer examination that the viewer can become intimate with the person in the photo, especially identifying that image in the context of gender. The images of women are uniform in their presentation, each representing the particular brand of the collectivist communist ideology imposed by the Khmer Rouge. Individualism was stamped out by the regime, and women were required to cut their hair in the Maoist style and dress in uniform black pajama-like attire, further stripping them of their individuality. The memorialization and collective memory of the genocide and women's experiences, as represented in the photos of Tol Slang, have in a sense commodified the ideology of the regime they vilify. Largely unintended, the lack of any pre- or post-genocidal effort to identify these women as individuals essentially means that Tol Slang's collective memory of genocide has created a double victimization of women's genocidal experiences. First, they became victims of a cruel regime, and secondly, as nameless victims in post-genocidal memorialization. Without identity, how is lasting peace possible in a post-genocidal society, particularly if memorials are to serve as a tool of remembrance and a vision of never again? Now, what I find interesting is what also forms part of the Tol Slang Memorial are the paintings of Von Noth, one of the 7 survivors of the prison. He was chosen to live because of his skills, and he was then assigned to paint portraits of Pol Pot and that clique. So Noth's painting portray all the horrors of Tol Slang and even depict the suffering of women. In a trope reminiscent of the Pietà, Von Noth paints a mother with dying child. And as Janet Jacobs would ask, is this sort of motherhood type of representation, this sort of universal symbol here? Noth was a Buddhist who never converted to Christianity, unlike a few of the Khmer Rouge. And so this motif of his led me also then in that previous slide to look at mothers and children, and those photos are particular photos of mother with children as they process through Tol Slang. So it's through Von Noth and his paintings that we get a glimpse of the suffering of women and these sort of disrupted versions of what I call the Pietà. Interestingly, in the north of Cambodia, there's a monument or a structure that was built by outsiders. So Cambodians living outside of Cambodia contributed to the formation of this monument. And it's a 2-tiered concrete bas-relief that actually depicts the beginning of the genocide starting in April 17th with the evacuation of the cities. And it chronicles the story of the genocide going around. So, of course, it does depict the horrors of women in terms of rape, rape, the communal marriages, etc. But what I also find very interesting about this monument, and it also projects and portrays women as perpetrators. This is the first time I'm seeing women engaged in actual killing and perpetration. When we look at women's roles, and I'll leave that for Martha. When we look at women's roles in the recovery of memory in post-genocidal Cambodia, it's not as prevalent as their counterparts in Guatemala. So women's activism centers more around retaining land and housing rights as their communities are falling victim to development schemes. And this is really a byproduct of the genocide, that destruction of land and that dislocation of that population. And so women's roles are, in terms of NGO, are prominent in the area of education, and their activism really centers today on providing testimony as civil parties in the ongoing trial of the KR senior leadership, and more in the promotion of human rights. So genocide memorialization has largely been taken up by the Documentation Center of Cambodia, DCCOM, an independent Cambodian research institute since 1997. And DCCOM has set out to map the killing fields of Cambodia and to memorialize its victims. However, this task is not without controversy. In March 2015, a polished marble memorial was unveiled at S21, and the memorial will eventually list all of the 12,000 prisoners who passed through S21. The director of DCCOM views the inscribing of all these names as controversial because approximately 80% of the prisoners who processed through S21 were Khmer Rouge cadre, and as the regime began its sort of internal purges. Yet the German government, who funded the project, takes the position that the line between victim and perpetrator is not always easily drawn. Today, DCCOM has embarked on this sort of memorial building, and they have these Kickstarter campaigns to raise these sort of plaques to put in high schools throughout the country with just these sort of slogans that if we talk about the experience during the Khmer Rouge regime, this will promote reconciliation and education. I have my doubts about this because today, I mean, that I'm always reminded of that Cambodian slogan that men are like gold, women are like cloth. And so survival during the genocide really depended upon this cult of silence. And so today we see women now beginning to break out of that silence, especially in their talk about genocidal rape and so on. And so that there's a strong sense of distrust. So this education about the genocide, I don't think is really going to open up that sphere of forgiveness and reconciliation. I'm going to let Martha now come in and talk a little bit about Guatemala.
Thank you. And I will go quickly through some of the pictures that we took in our field study over there. And what I have seen in countries with Cambodia is women are more active now, and it has led to the trials. And I will explain that through my pictures. And when we got to the city, I was expecting more like a museum, so memorials. And when we got there, the first thing that we noticed was in the cathedral, they had the names of the massacres and the names and the pillars. You can see, I don't have a pointer, but the pillars that you can see in front of the cathedral, they have the names. But that's the only thing I saw. And then some of the walls, they put pictures, but that's like when they celebrate the February the 25th, the day you see a lot of the promoting that and the pictures of the disappear, but then you can see that they come and wipe out with painting and it's gone. So then new murals, street paintings you will see towards the year, but you don't see many of those. And then we took a trip to the north to one of the towns that is called San Juan de Comalapa, and in here I was impressed by the mural they have, but this mural is different. It's not just focusing on the conflict time, but it shows from the creation of the Mayan all the way to the present. So you have conquest, colonialism, and then you have the armed conflict, and then the peace, so you can see the doves, and then the role of women in the present. And this mural also is very important because you can see the images of the soldiers killing, and then the mother and holding the son. So in this Mayan community, also in the school, you have a mural depicting this kind of images, and this is to remember every day. You can see the kids when I was there walking every day, so that keeps them remember that they don't want this to happen again, like never again. So this is one of the paintings, and then I went inside of the cemetery, and then you also find out like the tombs with a name, and then it will say disappeared in 1983 and now buried in 2013. Thanks to the forensic teams and the anthropologists, now they find the bones and they're able to create, and this is what they say: we want a proper burial for our disappeared. And this is where they have found the bones and everything, and now they're doing this, and this is where we did find. And then thanks to groups like Conabiwa is the Community Coordination of the Widows of Guatemala. They have a strong role in these communities, and they have been able to put this monument with all the names of the victims, and they also very active in the city, creating education and helping women because they became widows. So now the women, they have like educational programs, and then they have become more open about talking about rape. This is one of the main topics that many women didn't want to talk about it, and thanks to that, now we have La Casa de Memoria that you can see. That's the only museum in the city that now you can see, again, from the creation all the way to the post-conflict era genocide. And you can see the names, and now you see the paintings of the perpetrators and all the names. And it will take, they say, like so many walls to put all the names, so they just put some of them. And then Rigoberta Menchú, she was a Peace Nobel Prize, and she also is a part of the end of the, when you walk in the museum, at the end you see the people that have great roles in the community, like Gerard, that he was the one that wrote a book with all the interviews and then of how many massacres. And then when he published the book, 2 days later he was killed. So the Catholic Church was also very involved, but now we see more women working in that. And then you have like a kind of like a quilt on the ceiling with all the names of victims, and then families have created those and they put those there, but they say they have others that they save them because they don't have space to put those. So that's what I saw in the Casa de la Memoria. And then we have the sepulchre, and this is a case just happened in February 26, 2016 of this year. Ironically, a day after every day of the, the commemoration of the disappear. And you can see still the stigma of women being raped. And when they won the trial, they didn't want to be covered because even though they were able to open and talk about it, it took many, many months. And even though they're Mayans, they have different dialects. You have translators. So you have people helping, like the Union of Women in Guatemala, trying to help them talk about it. First, like a trial of conscience, and then the real trial that happened this year in February. And this is one of the leaders or director of the Unión of Mujeres in Guatemala, and she gives the closing arguments of all the suffering of these women. And then at the end she said, and the present is feminicide, not only with Mayan women, but all the women in Guatemala. So this was a great step because this was the first time in the Guatemalan history that you have slavery, sexual slavery, and sexual violence being penalized as a crime towards humanities, and they got like 120 to 240 years of sentence for all these perpetrators. And then when this is what I conclude with the paintings that I saw, is still, again, you have a woman that represents the balance between memory and justice, and this is, you can see this still. I don't know if I come back the next time it will be there, because I tell you, they go wipe out those paintings. But this is, in conclusion, what I have seen. There's still a lot of work that I have to go in areas, so we have to go in the north, because one of the areas was the Shield Triangle, it's mountains, and it's very difficult to get there. And so you can see this more of those memorials for their own communities, not in public. So you have to go there, and sometimes it's very difficult to get there, and it's dangerous. So this is the last picture that really got my justice and memory. So I don't know. Thank you. Please.